Thank you all for joining. Good morning, good afternoon, good day. I'm Dave Rank. I'm a senior fellow here at CAP. I spent nearly 30 years as an American diplomat, largely focused on U.S.-China relations before coming to CAP. And earlier this year, I coordinated an effort we called a progressive, principled, pragmatic approach toward China policy. And if you haven't already read that report, we'll share a link in the comments. But it represents CAP's thinking on the priority issues we need to address in our relationship with China, based on the input from dozens of experts. And clearly, climate change is very high on that list. And you all know the statistics. If the world doesn't transform to an entirely clean energy-based economic system within the next 25 years or so, we'll see more frequent and severe heat waves, droughts, and other natural disasters. The world economy could shrink by as much as 10%. We could face even greater risks from infectious disease, food scarcity, irregular migration, and even military conflict over resources. And clearly, as the world's two largest economies and the two biggest emitters, China and the United States have to lead the fight against climate change. But the serious tensions between us, our diverging interests, and deep distrust make that difficult. So I hope that we can use today's conversation to explore the opportunities for, and frankly, the limits to U.S.-China cooperation to combat climate change. So I'm pleased to be joined today by Joanna Lewis, Georgetown University's Distinguished Associate Professor of Energy and Environment and the Director of Georgetown's School of Foreign Services Science, Technology, and International Affairs program. In the interest of time, I'm not going to give you her whole biography, but I invite you to Google her. But I will tell you that as a teacher, a writer, a policy advocate, and an implementer, Joanna has simply been at the center of efforts to advance U.S.-China climate cooperation. And I think no one is more qualified to talk about the challenges that our two countries face as we confront what is an existential crisis. Finally, as a quick plug, if you leave today's conversation wanting to hear more, I recommend that you take a look at her 2023 book, Cooperating for the Climate, Learning from International Partnerships in China's Clean Energy Sector. Finally, those of you who have read CAP's report, the one I referred to earlier on a progressive China policy, will know that Joanna led the team that drafted the climate section. Welcome, Joanna. And I'm also really pleased to be joined by Alan Yu, CAP's Senior Vice President for National Security and International Policy. For decades, Alan has worked on the world's biggest challenges, from human rights to non-proliferation, as well as the environment. On climate, he was an advisor to Presidential Climate Envoy John Kerry, and before that worked here at CAP as a Senior Fellow and Director for International Climate Policy. From 2014 to 2018, he was the Department of Energy's Director for Asian Affairs. And before that, he spent 2 decades with me at the Department of State as an American diplomat with postings in Washington, China, Japan, and Afghanistan, and as a Peace Corps volunteer in the Central African Republic. Alan, welcome. We have a really good audience online, so my hope is that this will be a conversation among the three of us, but not just us, also with questions from the audience. So for those of you in the audience, if you have a question, please put it in the chat, and we'll get to it as we get to the second half of this conversation. So with that, maybe we can jump in. And Alan, if it's all right, I want to start with you. And I want to, Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, showed up in Beijing, I think this morning. For a guy who spent 30 years traveling the world, I never get my time zones right. But he's there to talk about the big issues between the United States. And if you read the pre-briefs, climate wasn't one of them. They're talking about Russia, Ukraine, and the Middle East. And I guess my question is, given the state, is that significant? And given the state of U.S.-China ties and the domestic and economic and political problems both countries have right now, is it realistic to expect the United States and China to cooperate?
Thanks, Dave. Thank you for moderating this as well as leading on the China report, and really thrilled to be on this panel with Joanna, who is such a thought leader and implementing leader on these issues. It's a good question. I would say this. I think that that climate, it's clearly the administration kind of from day one said that climate is going to be central to U.S. foreign policy. It's not unusual for kind of the urgent, immediate issues to pop up as the headline focus topics that leaders gravitate towards. But it's clear that both kind of in word and in deed that this administration has made climate a top priority, and climate a priority in its engagement with China. I think one of the more tangible examples is John Podesta, who's the president's senior advisor on international climate, who's going to be going to China in early September to engage directly on these issues, undoubtedly to prepare the way for this being a topic if President Biden and President Xi meet on the margins of the G20. I have to believe that the National Security Advisor is going to be taking up climate. It probably won't be a central part of what he's talking about, because he knows that Podesta is got this under control, and we'll dig into it in more detail. So I don't really read much into that. On the question about kind of cooperation and competition, I guess I would pull back a little bit and just say, hey, the U.S.-China relationship across all kinds of issue areas, including on climate, is kind of been comprised of competition and cooperation, and it's just we work along a continuum. There was a period when cooperation, there was a little bit of a stronger lean into cooperation. Not so much the case these days, but not completely absent from the agenda as well, and we can get into that in more detail. But I think that there's room to do both, and I actually think that there's promise for good climate action, acknowledging that we have to deal with this reality of both competition and cooperation.
Thanks. And I want to get back to the John Podesta trip in a little bit. So if I can be Ezra Klein and stick a pin in that one. But Joanna, if I can turn to you, and I guess my question is, why do we need to cooperate? I mean, is there a reason that the United States and China have to work together? Why can't we just sort of do our own thing, maybe keep tabs on each other, what they're doing, but why the emphasis on cooperation?
Yeah, it's an important question, and thank you, Dave, and to Cap and everyone for putting together this great event. I think when political and economic tensions between the United States and China are high, I would argue this is exactly when engagement on climate change is of the utmost importance, because these are the times when we run the risk of derailing all the progress that we've made in our engagement with China on this topic over the last 30 plus years, right? And we have seen historically that U.S. engagement with China on climate change and clean energy has played a really important role in building up China's own capacity, both to track and reduce its emissions, as well as its ability to promote important aspects of the low carbon energy transition, particularly renewable energy and energy efficiency. And today, of course, we now see that China has leapfrogged many other countries in these areas, and our bilateral exchanges have become much more of a two-way street. And so, I also see that engagement has led to increased ambition, transparency, and trust between our two countries, right? And we saw this, I think, in the lead up to the signing of the Paris Agreement, again in Glasgow, and again in Sunnylands. And then lastly, I think it's also important for U.S. policymakers to be engaging with China so that they have a good read on China's current climate policy actions. And that's important for them to be able to justify increased ambition, here at home and particularly in Washington.
Thank you. the three of us were talking earlier this week or late last week, and it struck me, both of you said, oh, you've been to China in the last couple of months, which a few years ago would not have been a remarkable thing to say, but it seems these days that it truly is, that the number of people traveling back and forth has really dropped since the pandemic. And I wonder if you, maybe Alan, I'll ask you first, but the same question for you, or questions for you, Joanna, is where are the Chinese where is their thinking on climate these days? They have a lot of issues on their mind. They've got domestic economic issues. They're watching what's going on with the election here. So what's the state of their thinking? And based on that, if you were asked to tell John Podesta what he should do when he heads out in a few weeks, what would your advice be?
So I led a CAP delegation to China at the end of July. We were there for about a week. We engaged with a number of government officials, research organizations, universities, some NGOs as well, really to explore exactly those questions that you identified. What's happening in China on the climate clean energy space? What are they thinking about it in the context of both their domestic political situation, as well as obviously not divorced from how they are looking at the U.S.-China relationship, and also kind of what they're seeing as their responsibility globally. It's a don't want to make this sound trite, but it's a complex picture. As Joanna pointed out. China is going by leaps and bounds on renewable energy deployment. I mean, they set a goal to hit 1,200 gigawatts of renewable energy by 2030. We just found out that they crossed that mark this year. So they're on a pace that's just really incredible compared to what's happening in the rest of the world. But at the same time, they're continuing an economy that is based on, really heavy use of coal at a time when the world just can't be doing that. And there are clearly a number of economic considerations. There are kind of political economic considerations. And we had those conversations with counterparts in China, and I'll tell you, they were hard conversations. I think that there's a recognition that they need to start transforming their economy in order to meet President Xi's goal of China hitting carbon neutrality by 2060. But the pathway, at least from my perspective, just seems ambitious and frankly a little bit unrealistic, given the kind of investments and the kinds of policies that they have in place. So I think that if I were advising John Podesta, I would have him be having those hard conversations and try to understand what it is that they see as the path that they're going to take, policy and investment, et cetera, to get to that goal. And to really point to the fact that everybody is watching what China is doing, and that it has not only geopolitical consequences, but it also has survival of the planet consequences.
Joanna, thoughts?
Yeah. So yeah, I also had a great set of trips to China this summer. It was great to be able to go back, both meetings with officials in Beijing, but also touring, many of China's new clean energy manufacturing facilities, particularly EV and battery facilities around the country. There's really a lot happening on climate and clean energy in China right now. In terms of positive developments, I think we are seeing potentially some real changes afoot in terms of a slowing in coal power plant permitting approvals, which, has been, of course, a major focus of U.S. engagement and broader international pressure over the last couple of years. I think we're seeing a similar shift in the approvals and steel plant approvals and, sort of other heavy industrial products. And simultaneously, we're seeing significant growth in renewables and decreases in curtailment rates. And, of course, right now, the big issue is countries are in the process of developing their next round of NDCs, right? Their sort of Paris follow-on goals, which are due at the beginning of next year. And China, like most countries, is, having a very active policy process right now to put that together. If China is responsible for around 30% of global greenhouse gas emissions and, around 90% of the growth in CO2 emissions we've seen since 2015 when the Paris Agreement was originally adopted, it's going to be really important for China to demonstrate a very ambitious, NDC round 2 that results in absolute emissions reductions, by 2035, which is the goal year that countries are looking at. And there's a lot of thought about what that could look like, right? Of course, if you want to be in alignment with the 1.5 degree goal that is mentioned in the Paris Agreement, you would need to be looking at, around a 30% reduction from China's peak, depending exactly when that is, between the peak in 2035, and that also, that number is interesting because it's what represents sort of a direct line between emissions peak and China's own domestic carbon neutrality goal to reach carbon neutrality in 2060. So I think it'll be interesting to see, how those sort of the targets evolve and what we start to see coming out of Beijing. But beyond these, aspirational numerical targets, I think we need to move our bilateral cooperation agenda forward, as articulated in Sunnylands. I think, it'll be important for Podesta to do as much as possible, that given the short amount of time that's really left in this administration, to put it into a solid position going into the future. But, of course, the Biden administration's in a tricky position, given the U.S. election is going to be occurring about a week before the start of COP29 in November. So, given the climate record of the first Trump administration, no doubt Chinese leaders are watching this closely.
Joanna, it was interesting that you used a word that I have not heard much in U.S.-China conversations unless it's preceded by the lack of, and that's trust. You talked about trust in the U.S.-China climate relationship, and I'm interested in your sense to the extent to which that exists, and what the value of that is in terms of how the U.S. can influence the kinds of decisions China's got to make, and what do we have to do here domestically, not so much in the relationship, but here at home, to bolster that trust.
Yeah, well, I look at U.S.-China cooperation. I think there's sort of two key goals, right, that we can point to from a U.S. perspective. One is, as you say, getting China to do more, right, and maybe getting the U.S. to do more. But I think the other is the role that China and the United States can play in mobilizing global ambition. As the two largest emitters still, right, the rest of the world looks to the United States and China in particular to see where we can agree as we formulate our own climate ambition. And we've seen this many times, of course, play out in the international climate negotiations, but also in the negotiation of other global environmental agreements, such as the Montreal Protocol and the regulation of HFCs. So, I think that there's several areas where we see U.S. engagement having a direct impact on China's own climate policy decisions, including in the power and industrial sector, as I mentioned. But we've also seen positive developments on methane and other climate superpollutants like nitrous oxide. These are areas where China has sort of long left these gases out of domestic targets, and we've seen a real, I think, increase in domestic action in these areas as the U.S. and others have really brought it to the forefront. Carbon capture, utilization, and storage is another really important area where both the United States and China still have a lot of interest in trying to push this technology forward. I do think that there's at least two areas where, we're not really focusing our engagement where I think it's needed and where it could be extremely important. The first is in the area of clean energy supply chains. I think where the United States and China might be able to find common ground, this, many people might disagree with this, but I think, there has to be a conversation about our respective roles in global clean energy supply chains without just letting it devolve into a global trade war that will slow the low carbon transition globally. I think second is our respective relationships and responsibilities in assisting developing countries with their low carbon transitions, right? I think both of our countries can play an important role in this. We are not really discussing our respective priorities and responsibilities here. And I think, again, that could be a really constructive area. Everything from, the role that we're playing in development finance, and other types of clean energy financing in the developing world.
So thank you. I want to get back to the supply chains, clean energy supply chains in a minute. But first, let me pick up what you were just talking about with development assistance and U.S.-China climate cooperation or something else in the developing world. I assume I know you've read the Brian Deese Foreign Affairs piece on calling for a climate Marshall Plan that would make major investments, that would sort of restructure U.S. Development policy to focus on clean energy investments in the developing world, sourced out of the United States. And I wonder, Joanna and Ellen, I'll ask you the same question, the extent to which you think that's the sort of race to the top where the United States and China are competing against each other to be the suppliers of clean energy technology and systems to the rest of the world. Does that make sense? Is that a feasible way to look at how we might maybe not cooperate, but at least exist in the global community?
Yeah, happy to start. I think it's an important piece because, the article takes a much more global perspective to the low carbon transition than I would argue the IRA does, right? I mean, I think one of the limitations of the IRA, it has many strengths, but, many of its policies were designed without what I would consider to be sufficient regard for the impacts of these policies on developing countries, including of shifting clean energy manufacturing from low cost to higher cost countries, right, like the United States. And so, I think Deese picks up this point, arguing the U.S. can play a role in promoting U.S. technologies in the rest of the world. But I do think it ignores one key point, which is that not all countries sort of want to be reliant on imports from anyone, whether it's China or the United States. A lot of countries we see really want to benefit from the low carbon transition through green jobs and green industries directly. And that's why we're seeing a major increase in the proliferation of green industrial policies around the world. So I think, this is why this is such an important topic. And it's an area where the United States and China need to be having dialogue. Because I think we need to figure out how do we bring developing countries into higher value added portions of these clean energy supply chains in a way that might be in the United States' interest, for example.
Alan, Green Marshall Plan, thoughts?
Yeah. I think Joanna raises some important points. I agree that Brian's piece hits at part of the challenge, but not all the challenge. The Development Finance Corporation, as it's existing and operating now, has in principle this thought of trying to facilitate manufacturing and investment opportunities in developing countries to try to deal with the economic opportunities, economic and commercial opportunities of this green transition. It's underfunded. I think the DFC is trying to do a lot of different things. This is obviously a high priority, but it's one of many priorities. I think if we can find a way to get the DFC in the context of its current mission of trying to help to develop that manufacturing supply chain in these developing countries, in concert with what Brian is proposing in the financing of basically of exports of U.S. clean technology, I think that would be all for the good.
So let's then get back to supply chains, if we would. And I see there are a couple of questions coming in through the comments on that topic as well. I mean, you all know that the Biden administration put 100% tariffs on Chinese EVs. The Europeans announced a similar, although not quite so steep, set of tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. Canada yesterday made a similar announcement. What does that mean for U.S.-China cooperation? And then more broadly, I guess, Alan, I'll start with you this time, more broadly on global efforts to combat climate change. Is it a good thing to have multiple sources of this technology? Is it a bad thing? And where does it fit into the relationship?
Yeah, I guess I'll start, maybe I'll start from the perspective of how we can make the clean energy transition sustainable in a U.S. political context. I absolutely take Joanna's point that the IRA is fashioned in a way that doesn't factor in fully or it creates some conditions that are difficult for external countries. But I think what we need, what the administration calculated in its development of the framework of the IRA was we needed to develop the incentives, the policies, the investments, et cetera, that could demonstrate to the American people the direct benefit of a clean energy transition to them and to their lives, to their to jobs, to the costs of this transition, to impacts on communities, both from an investment perspective as well as from an environmental justice perspective. Those are all important factors that I think we had to do in order for this, for us to be able to have sustained U.S. popular political support for this really monumental economic transition that we're going through. It's clear that there's an international element that we have to be addressing now. Should have addressed earlier, but I think that there are obviously challenging domestic political circumstances that that created some obstacles for that. Who knows, as we go forward and we move into a next administration, whoever it may be, that this is an opportunity where we look to the U.S. as a leader to be pushing for this transformation, a leading role in this transformation internationally. I guess going back to my earlier point, I think the competition cooperation continuum is one that I think we just need to keep our eyes on and accept that that's the reality. I agree with Joanna. I think that on the cooperation side, we should be looking to work with the Chinese more on engaging with developing countries on development assistance, on capacity building. I think on helping policy leaders, investors, consumers understand the kinds of transition opportunities and challenges that are out there. I think we can do that without compromising our national interests. But it'll require some, political courage on the part of policymakers. We can dig in a little bit later on the supply chain and critical minerals. I think that one is an important objective. I think that one is going to take a while to get to a place where we can be working with the Chinese on.
Joanna, thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think, of course, by all accounts, the IRA is really moving the United States in the right direction in terms of making clean energy industries more competitive globally. I think, we have more to do in terms of innovation and, really making sure that the U.S. can be at the forefront of sort of the next generation of clean energy technologies, not just sort of the current generation. But I think one area when we think about competition with China, where, the IRA may have gone too far, is, in terms of completely excluding Chinese entities from participating in the U.S. clean energy sector. I think there are ways to take a more systematic approach to specific aspects of supply chains where, we see domestic manufacturing in the U.S. interest versus other areas where it might make more sense for U.S. firms to partner with other foreign firms or even Chinese firms in certain cases. I think we know how to do this in a way that protects national security, including data security, and directly benefits U.S. firms. There's a lot of experience in doing this with U.S.-Chinese joint ventures and tech transfers over decades. And I think that we need to think about, the reality is, right, and I saw it firsthand in China this summer, is that China has just made major technological advancements in the energy storage and electric vehicle sectors, and it potentially disadvantages American companies if we're not allowing them to cooperate strategically with Chinese companies. And again, I do think that there are ways we can do this that is smart and protects national security, but still allows us to leapfrog and take advantage of a lot of the, real impressive innovation that we're seeing coming out of China.
Alan, both of you talked about the IRA and the sort of transformative impact it has had on American climate policy. Alan, am I right in saying that the ethical and more, making climate, arguing on behalf of the climate from an ethical and moral perspective has not really worked, but what has worked is economic incentives? I mean, is that the lesson from the IRA? And if it is, or if there's some other lesson, what does it mean for the next administration, or maybe for the remainder, the remaining few months of the Biden administration?
Yeah, I think as far as climate and clean energy action goes, I think we need to have an all of the above strategy to, engage people where they are and what motivates them. I think that making the ethical and moral argument is, going to be persuasive for a number of parts of the American public. But I think the IRA has demonstrated very clearly that these financial incentives are the ones that really get people's attention. So I think I think the administration and external stakeholders, et cetera, should be making the arguments across all of those motivating factors. Both, I think, as we think about it in the remainder of the Biden administration, and then as we go forward into the next administration, whoever it may be. And I guess in that context, I think it's useful for us to be thinking about, okay, what could be the next chapter in addressing these, that kind of financial incentives approach. It could be, kind of keep on holding the baton and running that next lap to get what's on the books further penetrated, and there could be other new opportunities. I think there's this is going to be a huge priority. We're only just starting. I think that there's going to be a lot of work that we're going to have to do on.
Joanna, maybe I'll ask you to complete Alan's thought there. Is the next step, is it more IRA? Is it sort of doing another IRA? Is it finishing the work that we've got done out there? Are there other things specifically we ought to be doing? And again, this is in terms of not just what we're doing here in the US, but using that to leverage a global energy transition.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of exciting thinking starting to circulate out there, right? Whether you're sort of thinking about an IRA 2.0 or this clean energy Marshall Plan, right? About how we can really, I think, take what the IRA started and bring us to the next level, right? And, I see that there's a few pieces to this. I mean, I think one of the areas where that the IRA has made the IRA so successful is that you've got, red and blue states all benefiting from this, right? But I think there's more space for encouraging states to really build on, what they've started and to sort of make sure that these investments are going to be sustainable in the long term. I think, the other key piece, of course, is taking a more global approach, right, to the clean energy transition. I think the IRA, not surprisingly, is sort of very focused on getting the U.S. to be more competitive and particularly American companies bringing manufacturing here. But I think the idea of this sort of clean energy Marshall Plan and thinking about how to bring the rest of the world along is just so crucial, right? I mean, because ultimately, the United States plays an important role or can play an important leadership role in this, but the vast majority of emissions growth, in the next few decades are going to be outside the United States. They're going to be in parts of the world that are really needing to build their economies and continue to develop. And, we can really play an important role in what these technology choices look like in the coming years. I mean, we are in a really new world, right, where solar and wind in many cases are cheaper than their fossil fuel competitors, right? And so you no longer need the types of subsidies that we were talking about, a few decades ago to make these technologies competitive. And I think that's why we are seeing this shift towards, what we call green industrial policy, right, which is really much more about how individual countries can play a role and directly benefit, their own jobs, economies, people from the green energy transition. And, I think we need to be thinking about how you bring, so that these countries are more willing to build up clean energy if they've got green jobs and direct benefits that come with it.
Joanna, can I pick up on that, the clean energy transition in third countries? I know one of the major focuses at the end of the Obama administration was working with the Chinese, pressing the Chinese to do less in the way of funding of coal-fired generation in third countries. And to what extent has that been successful? In other words, looking at it now, 8 years later, has China reduced its funding for coal-fired generation? And is that a result of American pressure, or is it a result from a change in Chinese policy that would have happened anyway? Or is it a result of demand signals from countries that are buying this technology that say, look, why would we buy something where we have to keep buying fuel when we've got all these clean energy alternatives?
Yeah, I mean, briefly, I think it's a little of everything, that you just mentioned, right? I think that as I said, because you have this real shift in the economic viability of renewables, it looks a lot better to countries where it used to be, coal was really the cheapest option. That said, it really is a question in many respects of domestic policy signals and and I think there's still more that can be done there. I think we have seen some shift in the role that China is playing through the BRI and other sort of development finance instruments in taking a greener approach, and there's a variety of reasons behind that, right? I mean, we can talk about sort of overcapacity and looking for new markets, right, for Chinese technologies. But I think ultimately, that I think things are starting to trend in the right direction, but there's really a mixed bag of I guess, potential futures we could see, particularly in a lot of these pivotal countries that are your sort of major emerging economies and are going to be an increasingly large global share of emissions if they don't, take some pretty stringent domestic shifts to move away from coal and other fossil sources of energy.
There's a lot there. I've got a couple of election questions. One is mine, and then we've got one from the audience, and I want to switch over then to audience questions. Alan, my question on elections is, it's a very close election. My assumption, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that a Harris administration climate policy would look somewhat like a Biden administration policy, but that a Trump policy would be drastically different. And in the event of a Trump win, what is, not just domestically, but probably because that's the topic here, internationally, what's the US response from an organization like CAP? from organizations or state or local governments that are concerned about climate change, climate issues, what then?
Yeah, it's a good question. I guess what I would do is pivot a little bit to just the point that I think that on the U.S. domestic action front, that there are a combination of things that are happening that are going to keep U.S. domestic climate action on a good pace. I think that as we've all seen, the IRA has just created a flush of like big uh, financial investments across the country, but particularly interestingly in a number of red states that are driving battery storage, electric vehicle manufacturing, et cetera. And so I think that those kinds of investments and actions are going to stay on pace. And so that's going to feed into, again, the continued decarbonization of our economy. At the same time, state and local governments are also showing, and a lot of the decision making for these kinds of policy actions on the domestic front are happening at the state level, and those decisions I think are going to stay on pace regardless of what happens at the national level on the election side. I think there's no question that if there's a change in administration, that we're looking at the likelihood of changes in how the United States postures itself on the international climate stage. We'll see. It's CAP has its views on what the right approach should be. We will continue to advocate for that. And we'll advocate for that regardless of who the president is. If it's President Harris or President Trump, we're going to be pushing both, either of them, to be putting climate action as a high priority. We may have to emphasize it in different ways depending on the scenarios.
Joanna, can I ask you an election question, which is, I know you were in Beijing a couple of times this summer and you were talking to Chinese scholars and officials about the NDC. This comes from the audience. How much of the Chinese, as they think about what their next NDC will be, how much are they waiting to see what happens here in the United States? Or does that not really matter?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. I mean, the official line in Beijing would certainly be, it doesn't matter. We're going to, China's going to adopt target in line with their own analysis and their own national conditions. But in reality, of course, I think it matters. I think, we know historically that when the United States has sort of been in a position of leverage, for example, during the Obama administration, to put forth relatively ambitious goals, and then sort of discuss those side by side with Chinese goals, right, and how they might potentially line up in terms of global goals. That this can be extremely important, not just for pushing ambition in both countries, but I think globally. So, I do think that there is a lot of, I know there's a lot of analysis happening right now. A lot of the Chinese modeling teams are looking at what might be feasible in terms of China's NDC goals. But China has publicly agreed to an economy-wide all greenhouse gas goal. And if they're going to meet their first NDC, which by all estimates they are, which would require peaking of emissions this decade, then you're looking at an absolute emissions reduction target, right? Which is something that China's never announced before. All of its, CO2 targets had always been intensity based for the most part, other than this peaking goal, which didn't have a number attached to it. So, I do think that there's a range, but I think looking at the U.S. election, can kind of give China, it's sort of a thought exercise, right? I mean, I had my students run through what would China's NDC be, depending on the election outcome, and you can kind of game theory this out. I think certainly we're not going to hear from them before November. The targets aren't due until February 25. There are reasons to potentially submit them early, but probably not before Election Day.
But it seems that you can at least make a pretty plausible case that China has tended to underpromise and overdeliver. That there's talk now that China has already peaked emissions and maybe on the downslope, and that may be a good thing from some perspectives, but from the perspective of getting other countries to be more ambitious in what they're going to do, it may be not so positive. Am I right in my read on how China thinks about NDCs? Or
I think that's one way to think about it, but also remember, almost all of China's climate goals are enshrined in national law in some way, right? We can argue about sort of the stringency of and the enforcement procedures, but they're all reflected in China's 5-year plans. That the targets that get pledged in Paris are backed up by domestic policy, right? And we can't really say that the same for the United States. Our NDC is something that we think we're going to be able to patch together based on a variety of, policies sort of across multiple sectors, right? But we don't have a national climate law, a national climate target. So I think the under-promise, over-deliver is partly just a reflection of China's system and how when you put a number forward, it's a number you're going to meet, whereas we tend to put them forward more as a aspirational mobilizing force, right, to kind of get both policymakers as well as the private sector and others on board.
Helen?
Yeah, let me jump in. I agree with Joanna's analysis, and we encountered and actually had those conversations when we were in China last month. We had a long conversation. Well, not a long. We had a series of conversations with different counterparts on this whole question about kind of the characterization of under promise over deliver, and our point was that we absolutely understood both the kind of the institutional imperatives that kind of push climate policymakers in China to do that, as well as some of the geopolitical aspects of why they want to do that. Our point was that we're at a climate crisis, and that we need to be all of us need to be stretching ourselves and living and doing things that are in an maybe not comfortable way up to now, because our point was that the major emitters have to lead. As we saw in the Paris outcome, when China and the U.S. made its pledges and its affirmed its commitment to Paris a year ahead of time, it mobilized the world. This 2035 target is a really important milestone. It represents the halfway point between Paris and 2050. And it really is going to be an indicator of the direction in which countries are going on climate action. Our point was, the CAP point was, that we are going to be pushing the US government and the European government, and with this visit and continued visits in the future, the Chinese government, as the three major emitters, that they need to set targets that will set the context for global action. And that's going to mean, in candor, Chinese policymakers looking at and taking bold commitments that are kind of not in their comfort zone. I think that that's a conversation that is going to have to, continue between now and February. I think that external engagement, particularly from the United States, is going to be really an important factor in keeping that topic at the forefront. But in order for us to get the global mobilization that we need China to kind of break out from its tendency to go to the under promise, over deliver.
So we've got a couple of questions, several questions from the audience on a Harris administration, a potential Harris administration's approach to China. And the first one is from Kate Logan from ASPI, Asia Society Policy Institute. The Harris administration has an opportunity to tweak the Biden administration approach to climate generally, and to China generally, and to climate specifically. Are there specific things that a President Harris could do to make that relationship more constructive and productive? When I say that relationship, I mean on climate specifically. And what should she prioritize to give that the biggest impact? Joanna, maybe I'll ask you first. And then Alan, I have for you a specific question on natural gas that I'll get to.
I think it's an interesting question. I hesitate to speculate this early, but I think in general, if I were to, think about kind of what's missing from our current approach, right, to engaging with China, I think in many ways we're engaging only in the safe spaces in terms of track one engagement. And of course, there's a real rationale for that. But I think that there are just some tough issues that if we keep avoiding them in our conversations with China, they're only going to get worse and potentially derail the so-called, easier topics that we're currently engaging on. I mean, so to be specific, I think that we are not engaging on science and technology at all. We've basically, stopped all science and technology cooperation. We are renegotiating the U.S.-China S&T agreement that's been in place, since the 1979, is our first bilateral agreement. I think that we need to hit that head on. I think, again, it's silly to sort of make science and engagement on basic science a political issue. And I think we can be smart about how to do that. And again, in a way that protects, U.S. research. I think, other hard things that we really need to address head on is the trade issue. At this point, I think we've always thought that if climate is sort of the bright spot of U.S.-China cooperation, then we can talk about things there that will then kind of benefit the broader relationship. But if we're not talking about the really important things, I think we sort of risk even that part of the engagement becoming less valuable. So, whether it's discussing border carbon policies, whether it's discussing supply chains, tariffs, all the things we've started to talk about here. I recognize these are very complicated politically, but again, I think they're only going to get out of hand if we're not having conversations in this sort of in the climate space, where I do think that this is one area where there's trust, there are strong relationships, and we can actually make some real progress. So, I would sort of push for this more proactive approach to getting at the tough issues.
So, Alan, I'm going to give you a reprieve for a moment on natural gas, because I want to follow up with Joanna on CBAMs, on carbon border adjustment mechanisms. We don't have one, but the Europeans are talking about one. And it seems to be influencing Chinese thinking on how they structure their economy. Is that telling us we ought to think about a CBAM?
No, I think that it's worth thinking about a variety of trade-related climate policies that can, have really positive implications for the climate. I think a CBAM can go a variety of ways. I think one thing that we're seeing is we can't say it's in direct response to the EU CBAM, but there is a lot more focus within China on how they can reduce their own industrial sector emissions. We've seen several of Chinese industrial sectors now included in their own domestic emissions trading system, which wasn't the case until recently. And so they're really, I think, looking for additional levers to decarbonize a lot of these heavy industries that are potentially going to be subject to a CBAM. But I also think it's worth exploring, I guess what we would call the more carrot-focused trade measures, like GASA, the sort of US-EU Green Steel agreements, which are really looking for, creating these kinds of clubs that create this race to the top, right? And sort of say, if you can meet these stringent goals, you can be part of these trade relationships and have access to these trade partners, if you can green your industry. And there's a lot happening in China on green hydrogen, which is going to be used in a lot of these heavy industrial sectors and have a lot of really important implications for decarbonizing heavy industry. And I think giving China access to markets, in a way that would incentivize decarbonization of their heavy industries would have huge implications for emissions reductions.
Thank you, Alan. I promised I would make you Kamala Harris's advisor on natural gas policy. We have a ton of it. China's burning a ton of coal. Would CAP urge a Harris administration to press China to buy LNG as part of a emissions reduction strategy?
So what I would say is China already is buying a lot of LNG from the United States and elsewhere. As far as pressing for China to buy more, I think CAP's got a pretty clear view on the need to be transitioning away from natural gas. I think that we have a very clear view on the Biden administration's decision to put a pause on approval of export permits by the Department of Energy. So I think that we're seeing really positive steps on the Chinese side on the renewable space. There is, as Joanna mentioned, beginnings of good action on the coal side. I think that we would be continuing to push them for further decarbonization, but I don't think that we would be looking for increasing the natural gas trade.
I see our time. We're almost up to 1 o'clock, and I want to be respectful of it. But let me give both of you one last opportunity. Something that hasn't been, that you wish we had raised over the last hour, or something that we should be watching for in the next 5 or 6 months as really key to understanding the US-China relationship. Alan, I guess you're the home team. Since you're with CAP, I will give you the first opportunity, and then Joanna, I'll give you the last word.
Yeah, Dave, it's a good question. I guess I would say that as I mentioned earlier, and I know that the prompt was to find something new to say, but I would just reemphasize that this it seems wonky to people who don't live in the space that this target for 2035 is just another thing in climate diplomacy, but it really does have, I think, extraordinary importance that people should be paying attention to. I think that CAP, as I mentioned, is focusing on these 3 large emitters, the US, China, and the EU, and calling for them all to be strong leaders in setting the tone and setting ambition in their targets as a way to basically drive action and commitments by others. And so I think that in combination with continued strong domestic action, I think is going to be the key things to get us to where we need to be.
Yeah, and I would just say, one thing we haven't talked about that I think is extremely important is the importance of subnational climate engagement. I see subnational cooperation, not just as sort of a backup plan to a Trump presidency, but actually being valuable in itself, because both countries are really in the process right now of actively implementing climate and clean energy policy at the subnational level. Where the IRA is really, coming into fruition is going to be at the state and local level. And similarly, we see that in China. So I think it's really important because through subnational engagement, you are really engaging with next generation policymakers, leaders, who are going to be in that leadership role in the coming years. And we see that particularly in the Chinese system, but also the private sector, which can be increasingly influential in the Chinese context and the direction their policies take.
Wow. Well, what a really interesting time to be having this conversation. I am tempted to get you on the record right now that you will come back, both of you, in a year or so, to do a booster shot of where we stand, either 6-9 months into the Harris administration or the Trump administration, and where we stand on global efforts to deal with this really existential issue. So Alan, thank you very much. It's great to see you again. Joanna, I cannot thank you enough. It's really great to have you here. Appreciate your time here today, your time working on the CAP report, and the work you're doing over at Georgetown and other places. And to the audience, thank you very much. Thanks for great questions. And we will see you in a year, if not sooner. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dave.